Michael Kaskey Blomain will join me here to talk a little NBA Finals. The game tonight, you can hear it on 97.3 ESPN. The coverage starts at 8. It's, in my opinion, MKB, will be the final NBA game of the season. I think the Bucks will win the game tonight. What say you?
Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. I think that the Bucks have figured out Phoenix, obviously with the 3 straight wins. It just looks like, to me, the Suns don't really have an answer for Giannis. They haven't all series. And then when he's getting help like he has been from, Chris Middleton and Drew Holiday, when those 3 guys are clicking, the Bucks are really tough to beat. And it seems like they've kind of figured out that formula where all 3 of them can eat and all 3 of them can get their own, over the course of a game. So to me, barring, a great comeback game from Chris Paul, who's definitely not had his best series, I think this one probably wraps tonight also.
Yeah, what would this mean for Paul if he loses? He was such the story. If they end up losing this series, and how many more times is Paul going to be able to get a team back to this level? Does that change? Has he changed anything for himself? I've always been a Chris Paul fan, but there's a lot of people who said he can never win the big one, or, he couldn't even get his team to the conference finals.
Yeah, I mean, regardless of what happens in this finals, I think he definitely bolstered his legacy with this playoff run, taking a young, inexperienced team that had never been to the postseason and, obviously elevating them to the next level and ultimately getting all the way to the finals, I think will help his legacy. But if they do drop, this game tonight or ultimately drop the series, I think it will still be that knock against him in the conversation that, he was never quite able to get a team over the hump, never able to win the big one. And he has a history, almost like Doc Rivers. They lost some series when they were with the Clippers together when they had a 2-0 lead. This would be another series for Chris Paul that, if they end up losing, that his team was up 2-0 and ultimately couldn't finish the deal. So I think it could go either way, really depending on what side of the fence on the argument you fall on. If you want to, you could look at this, this run as, bolstering his legacy. But at the same time, if they don't finish it off, I think it could be used as another knock against him to show that, yeah, he's great, but he wasn't that top tier great where he could get a team to the title.
So what is Milwaukee doing to him? That is he not 100%? Are they doing something? What's going on with Paul in this series?
To me, it's all about Drew Holiday, Mike. I think they made a concerted effort after game 2 to, not give up switches so easily so that Paul could go to work on some of the other guys, the bigger guys in Milwaukee, whether that was Brook Lopez or, Bobby Portis. I think they've said, Drew, basically this is your assignment. And I think he's been doing a great job. He's been picking him up almost full court, not letting him, get any fresh looks, any air. And I think he's basically been, nullified a lot of what Chris has been able to do throughout the postseason. I do think he's a little bit banged up. He's had various injuries throughout the playoffs. There's, wrist injury, a hand injury. I'm sure that's playing into it, to a certain extent. But to me, I think you can't overstate how important Drew Holiday's defense on Chris Paul has been for the Bucks in this series.
Michael Kaskey Blomain, CBS Sports, covers the NBA and, of course, NBA Finals Game 6 tonight here on 97.3 ESPN. There's a lot in this series. Chris Middleton, what does this mean for him? Giannis is going to win the MVP, that we think. But what has this meant for Middleton and kind of the next stage of his career?
Yeah, Mike, I think he's leveled up in a big way in this postseason, and he's shown – that not only is he an all-star caliber player, but he's a guy potentially that you can really lean on, throughout an entire playoff run. And when the lights are the brightest and the stage is the biggest, like the finals have been, he hasn't shied away from the moment at all. He's stepped up, especially in the second halves of a lot of these games, and he's shown, his ability on the offensive end. He's such a multifaceted, multi-talented player on that end. He can shoot from 3. He can put the ball on the floor. He has a mid-range game. He can get to the rim. He's a good free throw shooter. So, he's pretty much the complete package on the offensive end. And I think, people already knew that. But obviously, when the finals come around, it's a bigger stage, more fans, more people watching. So I think he's really kind of just, leveled up, elevated his game and elevated his name in the fact of where, I think he kind of flew under the radar. He's made some all-star teams. He's been, widely regarded as a huge part of the Bucks. But I think moving forward, he's a guy that, when you're talking about Chris Middleton, this is a legitimate star.
All right. So this brings up an interesting conversation, I think, MKB, which is how will these finals dictate what teams around the league do? Everybody's always trying to get the 3 stars or multiple stars, and how they get them has varied. Free agency, trades, tanking. Will teams follow the path of either of these two teams, or are they viewed as a one-year anomaly?
That's a great question, Mike. To me, I think it's largely a one-year anomaly, especially when you're talking about the Suns. I mean, they're a young team. They didn't, to me, do anything that out of the box or that crazy. They drafted pretty well over the couple years. I mean, they obviously missed some picks like you and I have talked about before. But, they got Booker in there. They got Ayton. They got a couple decent role players. And then they just rolled the dice and brought in Chris Paul, and that combination of, the veteran leadership and his toughness and IQ combined with the skill of those young guys, really catapulted that team to the next level. And that's something that, teams always try to do. The Sixers try to do that in terms of, you get some young guys, you draft them, you bring them along, and then you bring in veterans to complement them. So, they didn't reinvent the wheel to me. They kind of just, caught lightning in a bottle with Chris Paul, and they obviously got lucky with some of the, injury issues to their opponents in this postseason. And the Bucks are, to me, in a similar manner. They had a team for a few years where they drafted guys, they brought them up. Obviously, they drafted Giannis. They picked up Chris Middleton from the Pistons when he was basically, a no-name guy, and developed him into the player that he is. And then they went out and, rolled the dice and brought in Drew Holiday. They paid a pretty hefty price, but they knew, that he would be a dimension that they needed, and they added him to their core. And, here they are. So to me, it wasn't something where either of these teams really did anything that crazy, but they kind of just followed, steps that have been laid out by other teams. So I think, to me, nothing is really going to change in the way teams approach, how they build themselves over the offseason, except for the fact that maybe teams will be a little bit more willing to roll the dice to bring in a guy like a Chris Paul or a Drew Holiday, even if the initial price is a little bit higher than you would, want as a team.
Okay, so Giannis wins a title potentially in Milwaukee. Does that change the view of a guy like Dame Lillard, who's saying, we've hit the ceiling here, we can't get any better? Does he say, you know what? He stayed in Milwaukee, went through a lot of losses, figured it out, and won. I want to follow that.
I think so, Mike. I think that would be, a model that you could fall after. Giannis has been in Milwaukee for 8 years now. Obviously, since that 2013 draft, they were a really bad team his first couple of years, and he stayed there. He re-upped. He allowed the team to build around him, and now they're reaping the benefits. I do think that, could kind of preach patience to other players around the league. Dame is his own case. Maybe he's reached a point where he doesn't think Portland could potentially emulate what Milwaukee has done. But it is refreshing in a league today where you see so many guys jumping ship, so many guys teaming up. Giannis's stance has consistently been that he's not interested in, joining a super team. He's not interested in teaming up with other stars, that he wants to do it his way, and he wants to do it in Milwaukee. So I think if they are able to do that, that there'll definitely be other players that look at that and say, hey, Giannis did it this way. There's no reason that I can't do it also.
Yeah, so obviously that would affect the Sixers potentially. They're one of the teams that keeps getting mentioned. Are you buying that the Sixers and Portland would be a good match if those two teams, in fact, wanted to talk to each other?
Yeah, I really do think that potentially if Dame was made available in trade talks, with the if obviously being the biggest factor there, we don't know what's going to happen with his future in Portland. But if it did get to that point where the Blazers decide that the best move for them is to move on from Dame, I think the Sixers could, come to the table with pretty much an attractive offer as any team, depending on what Portland wants to do. You assume if they trade Dame, it's probably going to trigger a rebuild. And at that point, a guy like Ben, who you could obviously still super young, still a lot of potential and some draft picks, you could do a lot worse than that. Potentially, if they wanted to remain competitive, maybe you give them a guy like Tobias that could plug in there and still keep that team kind of in competition in the West. But, the Sixers that's one thing they do have. They still have draft picks. They have good young players. They have assets. So, if it gets to that, I think the Sixers would be one of the teams that not only Dame would potentially be interested in joining because, of Joel and the fact that they have the chance to win a title, but I think Portland, the front office, would potentially be interested in what Sixers have to offer if it came to that.
Hey, you mentioned draft picks, and we hear a lot. The Sixers don't want draft picks most likely in return. But do you think they are willing, has Daryl Morey indicated or have any history of saying, I'll give you 2, 3 first-round picks? Like, will he pile on the picks to get a deal done?
Yeah, I think so, Mike. I think that he knows, for the thing with Morey is he's always has his finger on the pulse of the team. Obviously, he did this in Houston where they had an open window with James Harden. And, he tried to bring in Chris Paul. He tried to bring in Russell Westbrook way earlier. He tried to bring in Dwight Howard. He's not going to stop when he sees an open title window with a superstar player in his prime. It's what he did in Houston. Obviously, Joel was the runner-up for the MVP. He's in the midst of his prime right now. He still has, hopefully several great years ahead of him. And at that point, like you said, you don't want draft picks coming back. You don't want unproven players coming back. You want known commodities with very high ceilings that could immediately raise the ceiling of the Sixers.
Is there a draft choice number, though? All right, like if I said you're getting the third pick, is there a number that is acceptable
to get back?
Yeah, like if I said you don't want draft picks, but if I said you're getting the third pick, like how is there a guy that maybe at number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, hey, if I got the fifth pick, that would really help, like, and I would accept that. Like, is there a line of demarcation of the draft choice, or a draft choice is just not ready to help right now?
Yeah, from everything that I've been able to gather, Mike, I mean, maybe if they were presented with the top pick and they thought there was a guy that they could plug in immediately, but from everything I've been able to gather, from what I've heard, is that draft picks pretty much just aren't going to move the needle for the Sixers. They need, all the reports that have been out is they're looking for an all-star caliber player that's already established. And, it makes sense. They're a team that had title expectations last year. They're going to have title expectations next year. And it's not a couple of years ago where they had the time and the patience to, take on draft picks and build them and hope they develop. So I just don't see any deal based around draft picks getting the job done when it comes to, a potential Ben Simmons trade.
Yeah, so if I told you, without having the NBA draft order 2021, let's see. The first pick, from what I recall, will be Detroit, correct?
Yeah.
So if I'm Cleveland at number 3 and I say I'll give you Colin Sexton and the number 3 overall pick, you don't think that number 3 overall pick is sweet enough to take Sexton, number 3, in exchange for Ben Simmons?
I don't think so, Mike, because I think if I'm Daryl Morey, the way I'm looking at it is, you take the team that you just had on paper this past year, you look at what the potential to come back would be, and you look at it and say, is this team going to be that much better with X and Y compared to what we just had? In a deal like that, I don't think, Colin Sexton and a 3 pick in the short term, just helps you out in the way that they're looking to be helped out. So to me, I just don't see a deal being centered on draft picks working out.
MKB, by the way, number 1, Detroit, number 2, Houston, which is interesting because Daryl Morey obviously has some ties to the Rockets. Hey, can you give me the number 2 overall pick? Number 4 is Toronto. Do you think Toronto is a player for Ben Simmons?
They were interested in him, obviously, and he would be an interesting fit there. I just don't necessarily see what they would have coming back unless they, try to execute a sign-and trade with Kyle Lowry, maybe some other parts, OG Anunoby coming back to the Sixers. But the Raptors, to me, just don't have a lot of really intriguing pieces to potentially come back for Ben Simmons. Maybe there's always the possibility of a 3-team trade, getting another team involved and having some pieces kicking around that way. But in a 1-to-1 situation, I just don't see where they would really have the assets that would, make the Sixers want to jump on a deal with them.
Yeah, I know the Rockets seem like a long shot too at number 2. Orlando's number 5. Oklahoma City's number 6. I guess the Magic are always willing to wheel and deal. They would probably take on some salary, but probably not willing to take on a salary like, say, Tobias Harris.
Yeah, I mean, he still has 3 years left on that deal. It's going to be tough to get a team like the Magic in rebuilding mode to want to take that on. So, that's why, to me, I think it's somewhat unlikely that we do end up seeing a Ben Simmons trade in the short term. Not that he's necessarily going to be with the team by next postseason, but I think it's much more likely that he returns for training camp and starts the season on the Sixers than it is that, they end up settling for a deal like some of the ones we've been talking about, where, to me, the ceiling of the team just really isn't elevated much.
Golden State is number 7. They're interesting. You keep hearing buzz about the Warriors, that the fact that they might be interested in a player like Ben Simmons. I just keep looking up and down that roster and just say, I don't see a fit, man.
Yeah, it's almost the same situation we've been talking about, unless all of a sudden they felt like they wanted to potentially trade Klay Thompson or something like that. But if you're talking to Andrew Wiggins or James Wiseman and they have 2 picks in the lottery this year, it's the same situation that we were just talking about, where it just doesn't seem like that type of deal is going to elevate the Sixers in the short term. And it's hard to see Daryl Morey pulling the trigger on a deal like that.
All right, rounding out the top 10, you got Orlando again, Sacramento, and New Orleans. Sacramento, we talked about, actually you weren't on last week. Sacramento has come up a lot. It's kind of fizzled out a little bit. It sounds like the Sixers are interested in Fox. They don't want to give up Fox. Buddy Hield and Marvin Bagley and a draft pick. It would be this draft pick right here, I guess, was one of them. Multiple first round. Bagley, Hield, multiple first rounds. That puts your pile.
Nope. It's the same thing. Like, see, that they're interested in De'Aaron Fox, which to me, it would make some sense. Young guard, a lot of potential, high ceiling. Obviously, probably a more complete player on the offensive end at this point than Ben Simmons is. A deal like that would make sense. But as soon as he's off the table and you're talking about pennies on the dollar with a guy like Buddy Hield, Bagley or these draft picks. So, unless De'Aaron Fox is going to be included, or potentially even Tyrese Halliburton, who had a really nice rookie season with Sacramento last year, it seems to have a really high upside and could potentially, fill in that void for Philadelphia if Simmons was moved on. Unless those two guys, one of those two, are included in a deal, it's, it falls in that same category to me where it just doesn't push the needle.
Michael Kaskey Blomain, and of course the NBA Finals continue tonight right here on 97.3 ESPN. You can hear them all starting at 8 o'clock, the Ben Simmons stuff. And obviously there's going to be an interesting offseason here because we got the Olympics, we think anyway. That might happen, it might not happen. But we got Olympic hoops, the draft, Summer League, and the league is going to be back before we even know it. So there's going to be a lot happening in a small window of time. So it seems that Daryl Morey's going to be busy here in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. This offseason is, like you said, Mike, very condensed. It's almost already creeping into August, and the finals are still going on. And you didn't even mention free agency, fitting in there at the beginning of August in between all those other things. So, for the players, they'll get a brief break. But for us and for the front office, there'll be almost no break. The Sixers obviously will be scouring the draft and seeing if there's any type of trades or deals to be made up to that. And then immediately afterwards, you go into free agency. And then in September, training camp is going to start. So it's going to be another really fast-paced, compressed offseason. And the Sixers, again, are going to be right at the top of the list of teams to keep an eye on in terms of, potential for making moves.
All right, MKB, you like the Bucks tonight. I like the Bucks tonight. It'll be the final game of the NBA season. We both think tonight. If not, Thursday night will be Game 7 in Phoenix. And that would be really interesting. I'm kind of rooting for that, even though I'm picking the Bucks to win. I don't care about being wrong in the game. I'd like to see the Game 7. And, of course, we got, as Michael just mentioned, plenty of all-season storylines to keep an eye on, so we'll continue to talk NBA throughout the offseason. MKB, thanks, man.
All right, Mike, thanks for having me on, man.
Good to see you, man. And it's, of course, Michael Kaskey Blomain from CBS Sports here on the Sports Bash. He covers the NBA, and, of course, he covered the the Sixers for us at 97.3 ESPN. He is now covering the league nationally.